Hello everyone, and welcome to Madcap Experiments, the Magic the Gathering podcast that focuses on creative, and sometimes even competitive decks in Pioneer, Standard, and occasionally Modern. I'm your host, Odince. Today, we will be looking at some exciting new brews with the release of Edge of Eternities right around the corner. So without further ado, let's dive right in, beginning with one of my favorite cards from the set, Weapons Manufacturing. Now, Weapons Manufacturing is an enchantment for 1 and a red that reads, whenever a non-token artifact you control enters, create a colorless artifact token named Munitions, with when this token leaves the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to any target. There are a lot of exciting synergies to pair with a card like Weapons Manufacturing. Getting a token anytime a non-token artifact enters the battlefield, it's huge for strategies like Affinity, 8 Blast in Modern. It works really nicely with Improvise. Darksteel Citadel is a card that gives you a token for relatively low cost. And in addition, there are spells like Shrapnel Blast, Voltage Surge, Torch the Tower, instants that deal damage and require you to sacrifice an artifact as part of their cost, or an additional cost. These munition tokens work great with these types of artifacts because now you can either pump the damage that you're doing with these spells, or split the damage up. So in Shrapnel Blast's case, you can do 5 damage to the face, 5 damage to a shield druid, and then you can split that damage up 2 damage to your opponent, or 2 damage to another creature, potentially creating a nice 2-for-1. I'm most interested in finding ways to sacrifice or otherwise remove these tokens from the battlefield to gain additional shocks here and there throughout the game for value. One pretty important line of text on the munitions tokens is that it's actually a leaves the battlefield ability as opposed to a dies trigger, which is very nice in the case of the first deck that I'm going to show you, which is a Boros deck in Standard that revolves around Weapons Manufacturing and Pinnacle Starcage. Now, Pinnacle Starcage is the new temporary lockdown that we got in Edge of Eternities, with an important difference. It says, when this artifact enters, exile all artifacts and creatures with mana value 2 or less until this artifact leaves the battlefield. That does not exile our Weapons Manufacturing, but it does exile those munitions tokens, which are leaves the battlefield triggers, and so they will deal 2 damage to any target. This is a very exciting synergy that I'm looking to exploit. In this case, we can use Pinnacle Starcage not only as a board wipe for cheap creatures and artifacts, we can also use it as a way to 1. Remove those munitions tokens to get their abilities, and 2. To flicker our value artifacts and creatures that we might have in our list. A nice sequence here is that when Starcage enters the battlefield, it triggers Manufacturing, so you can arrange your triggers in such a way that the new munitions tokens will be removed with Starcage's ability, netting you an extra shock. Another feature is that if you do choose to sacrifice Starcage on a later turn, or it gets removed, any of your exiled artifacts will trigger Manufacturing again on return, as well as any of their own enter the battlefield triggers. Generally, you wouldn't want to remove your own lockdown style card, since your opponent also gets their permanents back, but hopefully we can mitigate some of that perceived loss of value by returning some of our exiled artifact removal spells to snipe their creatures on the way back, while also setting up for future Starcages. Let's run through a hypothetical scenario to help visualize how this strategy might play out. We put Manufacturing on 2, something like Chainsaw to kill a creature on 3, maybe a cheap 1-mana artifact like Candy Trail 2 for lucky, and at this point we've made 2 munitions tokens. Turn 4 we can play a Starcage and hopefully sweep the board in the process, while exiling 3 munitions tokens. That's 6 damage to maybe kill a bigger creature that didn't get hit by the cage, or that's 6 damage that we can split up straight to the face. From here, maybe we play a couple more artifacts as the game continues, until at some point we can sacrifice the Starcage, hopefully because we have another one in hand to trigger all of the munitions tokens we've made throughout the turns, and from the exiled ones coming back into play. Now there might be a little bit of tension here between Starcage and something like our Carrot Cakes and our Legion Extruders, making all these tokens, but I think that's kind of the fun balance of the deck. We have sort of a non-linear game plan here that we get to kind of pick the pace of play as we go. We always have the option to get these tokens back when our Starcage leaves the battlefield, and we can always make more. In addition, Starcage also has its own plan B built in, with its ability for 6 and 2 white to put each card exiled with this artifact into its owner's graveyard, and then create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token for each card put in a graveyard this way. Sacrifice it. So while you're not going to get your artifact ETBs or anything like that, because they will be put in your graveyard, you are going to have a nice way to close out the game for 8 mana. I don't think this is an ability that we should rely on, but it might come up. Instead, we're going to be relying on cards like Torch the Tower, Legion Extruder, and even Ragost, Deft Gastronaut, which is another exciting creature from Edge of Eternities. So what are the artifacts that we're looking to get value off of weapons manufacturing and eventually flickering them with something like Starcage? One of the first ones is Legion Extruder, a card from, I believe, Big Score. Legion Extruder is 1 in a red for an artifact with an ETB that deals 2 damage to any target, and an activated ability for 2 in a tap, sacrifice another artifact, create a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token. Now this is a card I see being paired with weapons manufacturing a lot going forward, and especially in a format like Standard Pioneer. It's got that ETB is okay. It's not great on rate for 2 mana, but sometimes you might kill something and that comes up. 2 damage to the face also stacks with those munitions tokens that we are going to be sacking to the extruder itself to make 3/3s. Cash in a munitions token for 2 damage, 2 mana, and you get a 3/3 golem in return. That seems pretty good. It's in the right color pair. I see these cards pairing very well in the future going forward. You also get that 2 damage ETB on return if we ever flicker it with something like Starcage, which seems great. We also have a nice little suite of artifact removal spells in Chainsaw and Perilous Snare. Chainsaw is 1 in a red for an artifact with an ETB that deals 3 damage to any target creature, and it can power up a creature later on as an okay equipment. And Perilous Snare is a card we've seen many times. 2 in a white for an artifact ETB. When it enters, exile any non-land permanent until it leaves the battlefield. Notably here, this one does not get exiled by our Starcage, which is actually pretty important. We don't really want them getting their value piece back, especially since this one isn't gated by mana value, so it does let us get rid of those bigger threats that would be traditionally harder to get rid of with our red removal. Carrot Cake is a nice value artifact with an ETB and a leaves the battlefield trigger, giving us those 1/1s, letting us scry, and even gaining us life in a pinch if we need it. It's a nice card to sack to Extruder. It's a nice little value piece that we get. We get those tokens back when it comes back if we manage to remove our Starcage. Candy Trail is a nice cheap artifact that gets the ball rolling with manufacturing, acts as a cantrip in the later turns, gets to scry on ETB both the turn that we play it, and eventually if we ever get it back with something like Starcage. Kind of a nice piece to tie the whole deck together, kind of necessary to smooth out the early turns, make sure we're hitting the land drops with the scry ability. Nothing special. You could also replace this with something like Nutrient Block from the new set if that's something you're interested in. Right now I'm valuing the ETB a little bit higher than the leaves the battlefield trigger, but Nutrient Block is a card that pairs very nicely with Legion Extruder and Torch the Tower, cards that we're already trying to enable with weapons manufacturing. So there's a lot of synergy there, something you could definitely try out. Now I mentioned this creature earlier, but let's dive into Ragost, Deft Gastronaut. For a red and a white, for a 2/2 legendary creature, lobster citizen, it's got this crazy ability. Artifacts you control are foods in addition to the other types, so they get that 2 in a sack to sacrifice, you gain 3 life. It's also got the ability for 1 and you tap it, sacrifice a food, it deals 3 damage to each opponent. And then, at the beginning of each end step, if you gain life this turn, untap Ragost. So, it does a few things in this list that's actually very exciting. One, probably most importantly, it gives those munitions tokens an ability to sacrifice themselves. So all these extra tokens that you might have lying around in the later game, well now you can pay 2 to sack them, deal 2 damage to any target, and gain 3 life. Its sacrifice ability itself is going to help you close out the game in the later turns, especially if you got multiple foods lying around. You get to do it once during your turn, untap, hit him again for another 3 damage. That's going to close out the game pretty quickly, especially if those foods that you're sacking are actually the munitions tokens. So now you're dealing 3 damage and 2 damage. It's going to close out the game very quickly. One other notable sack outlet that I want to talk about for this list is actually Fountain Port. Fountain Port is already a card that's established itself in both Standard and Pioneer. It's got that great ability for 2 and tap, sacrifice a token, draw a card. So for 2 mana, and to tap it, in the end of your opponent's turn, you get to deal 2 damage with that munitions token to any target and draw a card. This is a powerful synergy that comes with a relatively low opportunity cost that we get to sneak into our mana base. This, along with Legion Extruder, makes for a very nice package that works with weapons manufacturing that I think you'll see in a bunch of different decks, especially ones that I've brewed. Another fun piece to top out the mana curve here is Tunic, Steadfast Second. This is a card I plan to brew around with a lot, and I even have another standard list focused on them that'll come up in the next episode. Tunic reads, other creatures you control have haste, and artifact cards and red creature cards in your hand have warp for 2 and a red. Now warp, if you don't know, gives a permanent in your hand this ability. You may cast a card from your hand for its warp cost, exile that permanent at the beginning of the next end step, and then you may cast it from exile on a later turn. Lots of possible big artifacts and creatures to cheat into play with Tunic, but all of our artifacts are relatively cheap. So what does he do for us here? Well, Tunic lets us double up on our ETBs by warping our artifacts. We can pay an extra mana for Chainsaw to warp it in, and it'll leave at the end of the turn, and then we get to play it again on a later turn. Tunic sort of turns our artifacts here into adventure spells. Now the biggest implication here is with Starcage. We get to warp it in, triggering all of those wonderful munitions tokens, get more at the end of the turn when it leaves, and then do it all over again the next turn. If Argost happens to be one of the cards that you return, it'll get haste, which is a nice little bonus. The game plan with Tunic might be a little small ball here compared to what you might expect from a creature that lets you cheat in huge artifacts or creatures, but I think it's the perfect piece to let us really go over the top. The only card I haven't talked about yet is Get Lost. Pretty self-explanatory, but a nice piece of removal to round off what I think is a very interesting control-type shell that we get to play in this new standard once the format rotates. And for what it's worth, those map tokens will be exiled when we play our Starcage, similar to how Get Lost has interacted with Temporary Lockdown in the past. I think it's really important with weapons manufacturing to be playing a lot of artifacts in your list to make sure you are capitalizing on that ETB trigger, to make sure you're getting as many munitions tokens lying around for that late game to really capitalize on our synergies, to beef up our Torch the Towers, to turn them into 3/3 golems with our Legion Extruder, to draw extra cards with Fountain Port, and fortunately I think we have a lot of great artifacts that we don't feel too bad about playing. Temporary Lockdown, as I mentioned, is a card that has proved itself, and Pinnacle Starcage might not look as good as Temporary Lockdown at first, but I think those differences are very key, and as proven by this list, somewhat exploitable. I think this list is going to have good matchups against some of the very aggressive decks that we're going to see in the format. Pinnacle Starcage is going to be huge here as a nice sweeper that both hinders our opponents and potentially helps our game plan. And Boros is one of the winners of rotation, both in getting a shock land and not losing the fast land, which makes this one of the more optimal color pairs to be playing with weapons manufacturing in this format. Next, we're going to hop over to Pioneer for another manufacturing deck that I'm very excited to play, and hopefully when Rakdos gets better mana in Standard, I'm going to try this list there as well. But this list focuses on the synergies between weapons manufacturing and a very exciting mythic from Bloom Barrel, Rotten Mouth Viper. Viper is a card that I've been seeing Aspiring Spike play a little bit here and there lately, and it's got me very excited for these sacrifice artifact synergies. Rotten Mouth Viper is 5 and a black for a 6/6 elemental snake creature that reads, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice any number of non-land permanents. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each permanent sacrificed this way, and whenever Rotten Mouth Viper enters or attacks, put a blight counter on it. Then for each blight counter on it, each opponent loses 4 life unless that player sacrifices a non-land permanent or discards a card. If there's one thing Magic players love to do is cast high mana value spells for 0 or next to no mana, and Rotten Mouth Viper lets us cast it for up to 1 black mana, which is very exciting. Viper pairs very nicely with weapons manufacturing. It gets to sack all those munitions tokens that we have lying around, and in a pinch, or in a really aggressive turn, we can even sack the manufacturing itself to turn it on. Being in Rakdos to play Viper also gives us access to a suite of really powerful ETB artifacts. Something like Tithing Blade for 1 and a black, which enters and makes your opponent sacrifice a creature, Blood Fountain for a single black mana that gives us 2 artifacts because it ETBs and gives us a blood token. Grim Bauble for 1 black mana with an ETB to give a creature -2/-2. We also have stuff like Virus Beetle for 1 and a black, ETB, it's a 1/1, makes your opponent discard a card. These pieces are okay on rate themselves, but they really tie this package together. Tithing Blade does something on ETB and just sits around to both discount our Viper, trigger our manufacturing, sack to our extruder or our fountain port. It even helps to discount the couple of copies of Herald of Anguish that we have in the list as well. Similar to Boros, a lot of these slots that would be taken out by instant and sorcery removal traditionally get to be replaced with artifacts to really up those artifact counts for manufacture. Spike had a couple copies of Lava Spur boots in his list, and while we don't have Urza's Saga, I do think it's worth including a couple to try and haste out our Vipers, or even our Herald of Anguishes if we have the mana to do so. More on Herald of Anguish in a moment. Edge of Eternities also gave us Embrace Oblivion, which is kind of like an upgraded Bone Shards. It's a single black mana for a sorcery that reads as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or a creature, destroy target creature or spacecraft. I don't expect to see too many spacecrafts, but this is a nice piece of removal that isn't limited by mana value, power and toughness, etc. And it's a great sack outlet for those munitions tokens. Now back to Herald of Anguish. For 5 and black, we get a 5/5 demon with flying, but a very important keyword here, Improvise, which lets us tap artifacts to reduce its cost for 1 colorless per artifact, letting us cast it for as low as black. It's got a great ability that says at the beginning of your end step, each opponent discards a card. It's very nice disruption that really makes this card a threat. And it's also got this additional ability that in the past hasn't come up for me a lot, but I think is very exciting in this shell. For 1 and a black, you can sacrifice an artifact, target creature gets -2/-2 until the end of turn. You can see where I'm going with this. Sacrifice a munitions token, and now for 1 and a black, you can deal up to 4 damage or kill 2 2/2s, etc. It's a really fun threat that I think combines very well with Rottenmouth Viper as a nice artifact threat package. Now there is a little bit of tension here between Herald of Anguish and Rottenmouth Viper. Rottenmouth Viper might sacrifice all of the artifacts that you were hoping to tap for Herald of Anguish, so you might have a couple awkward turns here and there, but I do think it's worth trying out both of these creatures in this list. In addition, we're playing a playset of Blood Tithe Harvester here. We've seen how good this card has been in Rakdos in the past. I think it does a nice job here. We do even have additional blood tokens being made through our blood fountains to increase this card's utility as a removal spell. It's also really nice to suit up with the boots at a later turn, swinging for 4 power. Overall, I think it fits really nicely here. That kind of sums up this list. Pretty straightforward, but I do think Rottenmouth Viper has the potential to be a really huge bomb here that we can accelerate out very early, sometimes as early as turn 3. And while I think it'll be nice to give it haste, I don't think it's as mandatory in a format like Pioneer, where it is in a format like Modern. This is another deck that I think is going to be a lot of fun to play, and I'm going to be trying to play this in the first weeks of release. The last list that I have for weapons manufacturing is a Pioneer list I'm affectionately calling Shrapnel Control. Shrapnel Blast is a pet card of mine, and I take any chance I get to throw it in a list. The game plan here is pretty simple. We play a bunch of cheap cantripping artifacts to make munitions tokens, and to sack to our red removal spells. Torch the Tower, Voltage Surge, and Blast itself. And we try to control the board with these spells until eventually we can turn the corner and start pointing our blasts and munitions tokens at our opponent. I really like Mishra's Research Desk here as a nice form of card selection that lets us double dip on munitions with its Unearth ability. If you don't know what it does, it's an artifact for a single colorless with a tap ability for another colorless that lets you sacrifice it and exile the top 2 cards of your library. You choose one of them, and until the end of your next turn, you can play that card. It's got Unearth for 1 and a red. Great for hitting those land drops and finding the right piece of interaction. Experimental Synthesizer plays a similar role, but its effects are much more immediate, so it might be something you want to save for the later turns when you have the mana to make the most of it. I'm testing the full playset of Nutrient Block here as well. We have tons of ways to take advantage of that ability to draw a card when it goes to the graveyard. We also get Darksteel Citadel here as an easy way to trigger manufacturing, and it's the perfect artifact to sacrifice in later turns for that last bit of damage with a Shrapnel Blast. Demand Answers is an upgraded Tormenting Voice that we get to cast at instant speed, but more importantly, we can sacrifice an artifact instead of discarding a card. 2 mana for a Divination and a Shock seems pretty strong to me. This list is a little bit more speculative than the others, but it's something that I'm eager to try. I'd like to try something like this in Modern as well, to play with Bauble, Pirate Spellbomb, and Galvanic Blast, but I'd probably have to sell a kidney to get Mox Opals and Urza Sagas. If you have access to those cards, maybe give something like this a try. So that's it for my weapons manufacturing list at the moment, but I did want to make note of some of the other ideas to do with the card that I haven't fully fleshed out yet. Manufacturing can go infinite with 2 Metalwork Colossus, assuming you have enough artifacts in play to make the Colossus cost 0 mana. That definitely takes some setup, but if you have a Colossus in grave and one in hand and a manufacturing in play, you can cast the one in your hand to make a token, sack the first one and the token to return the Colossus in your graveyard back to your hand, and then rinse and repeat until you've done infinite damage. I also really like how manufacturing works with Duretti, Rocketeer Engineer from Aether Drift. I think Duretti gets a lot of fun new toys in Edge of Eternities, and I'll definitely have some lists centered around him at some point. Manufacturing can give you extra artifacts to sack to his ability, which in turn will trigger the manufacturing again. A nice little combination to make sure you're never running out of gas while you're bringing back your big artifacts. I'd like to take a quick moment to look at a couple of lists involving another artifact-centric card from Edge of Eternity, and that's Nutrient Block. I think when most of us see an indestructible artifact, our mind immediately goes to Ensoul Artifact. So that's exactly what's up first. Ensoul and Pioneer seems to get a new toy every other set, and this time we get Nutrient Block. I've long been a Darksteel Citadel hater in these Pioneer and Soul lists. I think it's pretty slow. It attacks the earliest on turn 3, and that's the turn that hopefully we've effectively won by. It's also hard to slot into the mana base, especially since Voldaren Epicure and Spyglass Siren have become mainstays in the list. We really want perfect mana on those early turns. Diamond Pickaxe is also an artifact that has been tested in these Ensoul shells, but it doesn't really do anything besides being indestructible, at least not well. And that's coming from somebody who's tested it with Fervent Champion in some of these Ensoul decks. Nutrient Block fixes both of these problems. It's an indestructible artifact that can attack on turn 2, and in the games where we don't draw our Ensoul, it helps us dig to them, while also keeping us alive. I think it's really important to try and mitigate being 2-for-1 on our Ensoul plays, and Block also helps us do that. And it draws a card when it sacrifices Shrapnel Blast, and that always feels great. I generally build my Ensoul list very aggressively, opting for the maximum amount of disrespect. That's why I've included Leyline Axe and Fervent Champion in this list, as well as the Banned and Standard, Core Steelcutter, and Monstrous Rage. Our 5/5s aren't getting chumped anytime soon. I've seen some of the current Ensoul lists playing stuff like Floodpits Drowner and Cryptic Coat, and while I think it's neat, it just kind of feels wrong to me. We're not really trying to interact here. Cutter, Leyline Axe, and Monstrous Rage all let us push through with our Ensouled creature, while also being strong cards in their own right. We play a lot of creatures that these utility pieces can pump up and make into threats in the later game. Cutter and Rage are pretty self-explanatory, but Leyline Axe has some great lines for this deck as well. It's obviously the worst card to top deck in the list, but I think the upside makes it worth it. Most importantly, it ups the number of turn 2 Ensouls that we get. But if we take the standard line of Epicure or Siren, and now Nutrient Block on 1, Ensoul on 2, and we add Leyline Axe to the mix, we can now swing with a 6/6 Double Strike Trample on turn 3. Obviously that won't happen every game, but it's going to be so much fun when it does. If you want to try something like this in Standard, there is Zoetic Glyph to act as a 3-mana Ensoul, as well as the new Synthesizer Lab Ship that acts as a mini Ensoul. Check in next episode for a spicy list with Lab Ship. Next up, we have another list that's main plan is an indestructible 5/5, but this time we're in mono black, and the card in question here is Phylactery Lich. For triple black, we get an indestructible 5/5 with the text, as it enters, put a Phylactery counter on an artifact you control, and when you control no permanents with Phylactery counters on them, sacrifice Phylactery Lich. I've tried to play Lich with Darksteel Citadel in the past, but it has the same problem the Ensoul shells have, where it slows us down by a turn. Nutrient Block also mitigates that problem. In addition, it's a food we can sack to our Cauldron Familiar, but now we can draw as well. This list definitely has more of a mid-range control playstyle, and Nutrient Block is a nice role player here with cards like Deadly Dispute and Embrace Oblivion, on top of its interaction with Lich. Herald of Anguish also makes an appearance in this list, as well as a couple copies of Demonic Junker. And that wraps it up for today's episode. If you stuck around this long, thank you so much for checking out the very first episode of Madcap Experiments. All of the deck lists I talked about today will be in the podcast description, so check those out. Join me next time and we'll take a look at some Tanook Steadfast Second Brews, a couple of lists involving a 3-mana 9/9, and finally a couple of my favorite rogue decks to play that get a new card or two from Edge of Eternities. Thanks again, and I hope you all have a great day. This is Odince, signing off.